Welcome and thank you for joining the CIPS GEP webinar today on Brexit and beyond, tips and tools to help procurement prepare now. My name is Danielle Goodrick and I'm the Knowledge Product Manager for CIPS. Before handing over to Rob from GEP to start the webinar today, I'd just like to give a bit of background and context to the joint webinar today. So, in my role in the CIPS Knowledge team, I work really closely with the knowledge partners to provide valuable content and resources for CIPS members. So I'm really delighted to be able to introduce the webinar today. I've had the pleasure of working with GEP over the last couple of years in both their knowledge topic areas. They provide such valuable content and insight through the partnership, and their thought leadership papers are among the most read documents in CIPS Knowledge. Today we're discussing the high-profile topic of Brexit. It's timely given where we are with the announcements in the news currently, and we've had such a high level of interest. So we really hope that you find it valuable today. Procurement are facing some really big challenges around Brexit at the moment, and one of the key challenges is obviously around the nature of the deal that's been negotiated. Even with the deal announced, we've still got an enormous amount of uncertainty in the economy, and it's unlikely that it's going to continue to grow greatly. I mean, the target's been around 2.4% by the government, and it's lagging behind at kind of 1.3 to 1.6%. So there's a real challenge for procurement professionals, and the challenge is really going to be around the robustness of the supply chain and creating that competitive advantage for the organisations for whom you work. That's going to be key. And alongside the agility of the supply chain, to kind of help transform itself in the context of the challenges that we're facing going forward. So just before I hand over, I just want to draw on some key points from the recent survey that CIPS ran, which was the fourth Brexit survey over the last couple of years, that's published on the CIPS website, and I'll let you download in your own time. But I just want to draw on some of the key findings, because 1 in 10 UK businesses have said that they believe that they could go bankrupt if goods were delayed for just 10 to 30 minutes, for example, at customs as a result. And the longer this delay, the more likely their business would go bankrupt, with the proportion of companies going out of business increasing to 14% if delays reached 1 to 3 hours, for example, and 15% at 12 to 24 hours. And this is so unsurprising given that businesses have become so efficient and exceptionally lean, and where they're used to quick customs. So if there is any delays as a result of obviously the Brexit negotiations with regards to increased paperwork checks, queues, it will not only affect businesses, but it will also lead to a shortage of products on shelves and potentially an increase in prices for consumers as well. So it's really important that government put measures in place to keep goods moving, and that might come out in terms of the transition period. So in terms of steps that organisations are putting into place to mitigate some of those risks, we've found in the survey that over a quarter of UK businesses have already started to stockpile goods. 4% stated that they were also planning to in the future. And this isn't always possible for some organisations where they deal with perishables or don't have storage facilities, but it is an option for people looking to kind of stockpiling. One of the other steps being taken to alleviate the potential custom delays is looking at some kind of greater flexibility in contracts and looking at alternative suppliers outside the EU. We found that half of UK companies said that they would struggle to find suppliers and skills they need in the UK if they were forced to reshore parts of the supply chain post-Brexit. And that's because there's a lack of suitable alternatives. We've also found in the UK that there is, with 4% unemployment, there's a limited capacity available as well to reshore. So there is a lot to discuss still. Adequate time to prepare, have we got that? Time will tell. We'll see with the transition period, and I'll let Rob talk to you in a bit more detail about that. So it brings us to the webinar today. I think procurement are really in a prime position to step up now and help businesses understand and manage the impact of Brexit. And you can really kind of think beyond the obvious steps and look at some of the more latent risks to prepare now if you haven't already started. So presenting today from GEP, we have Rob Jones. Rob has over 20 years experience in procurement, working across a broad range of category areas and industries, so he's well placed to discuss and help you today. As I mentioned earlier, you'll be given the opportunity to ask Rob questions at the end, and we'll leave about 10 to 15 minutes for this. So please add your questions via the Q&A box. So without further ado, I'll now hand you over to Rob to start the presentation. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Danielle. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining the Brexit and Beyond webinar. As Danielle says, during the session, we'll walk through the various implications of the Brexit scenarios and how procurement can really take the lead in helping their businesses to prepare for any impact. Firstly, just a brief introduction for myself and GEP. Danielle's given me a brief introduction to myself. As I say, my name is Rob Jones. I have over 20 years experience in procurement, working across a number of different category areas from marketing, professional services, HR, right through to IT, and across a number of different industry sectors as well, from banking, insurance, consumer goods and telecom. The number one area, the business that our clients from GEP are asking for advice for at the moment is around Brexit and the impact on procurement. And so a lot of my time and focus has been on working with clients to understand the implications and put plans in place to manage those implications. And I hope to share some of that output and insight with you today during the webinar. A little bit about GEP and who we are as an organisation. We're a global consultancy group that are focused on providing procurement and supply chain solutions. We provide that from our 14 locations across the globe, and we provide a full range of procurement solutions from strategy development and delivery through to purchase to pay and source to contract software solutions through our Smart by GEP platform, and a range of managed services as well. Underpinning a lot of our services and our insight and underpinning this is our suite of transformative technologies such as AI, robotic automation and analytics. We have a broad client base, around about 250 Fortune 500 organisations across 30 different industries and sectors. And we manage spend on behalf of our clients of around about £72 billion annually. So with the introductions out of the way, I just wanted to talk about what we will cover during the webinar itself. So there is a lot of uncertainty at the moment, and the climate is of constant change in relation to Brexit. But there are things that we do know about Brexit, and there are things that we know about how businesses are preparing. So I'd like to talk through that first of all. The second area is, well, what role should procurement play in this preparation? How should they be supporting and leading their businesses in preparing for Brexit? I'd like to talk through a practical case study with one of our clients to show some tools and techniques as to how other organisations are preparing for Brexit. And finally, what's next? What steps can you take now to start help with your planning and help your business plan for Brexit? As Daniel says, there'll be a Q&A session at the end, so please submit any questions via the web app link. Okay, so what are the key challenges for procurement in relation to Brexit? Just to frame some of the key challenges that I think Danielle had mentioned at the start of the webinar. Yes, it's difficult to anticipate the unknown, and we are in a current climate of change, and there is still a lot of uncertainty. But there are things that we do know about Brexit, and this should place procurement in a prime position to take the lead and help their business identify and prepare for any impact. Business leaders, of course, are already considering the impacts on core parts of their business, the operational side of things, the supply chain side of things, thinking about cross-border trade, supply chain, movement of goods. But how can procurement help them think beyond the obvious and take steps to address some of the more latent risks in the supply chain? So during this session, we're going to crystallise what we do know about Brexit to help evaluate the different Brexit scenarios. We'll use a practical case study to demonstrate the tools and techniques to assess the impacts across the different spend categories, and then how to use these assessments to build a practical plan. So despite all the uncertainty, there are things that we do know. For example, the Brexit timeline. We know that in June 2016, the UK voted to leave the EU. We do know that the UK is due to leave the EU on the 29th of March 2019. We know that the exit deal has to be ratified. Any exit deal has to be ratified by both the EU and the UK prior to this date. And recently, the exit text has just been agreed between the UK and the EU on Tuesday of this week. That was ratified by the Cabinet yesterday. Theresa May received backing from her Cabinet yesterday for the UK part of the deal. In terms of the exit deal itself, well, these dates are to be final. The dates for the ratifications are still to be finalised, but the EU have today announced the 25th of November they will put the exit deal to the European Commission. The date for the UK is still to be determined, but it's expected that it will be in December of this year. What we do know as well is if a deal is agreed, then a transition period will commence, and that will take the UK and EU through to the end of December 2020. If no deal is agreed, then the UK will leave the EU on March 29th, 2019. Okay, so we also know the nature of some of the trade deals as well, and what the likely scenarios are likely to be. The first two, EEA access or Norway. Two, bilateral agreements similar to Switzerland. These two scenarios have pretty much been discounted by certainly by the EU. There would still be a preference for the EU. The third scenario is the free trade agreement, and this is effectively the Chequers deal that Theresa May is promoting. The fourth scenario is World Trade Organization terms, and this is what the UK would operate on in the event of no deal. The first three scenarios would enable a transition period. This would buy some time for the UK, but as we've seen since the invocation of Article 50, 2 years can pass extremely quickly. So preparations still need to start for businesses. In the event that World Trade Organization terms are invoked, well, minds will really need to be focused at this stage. But whatever the scenario and the outcome, there will be implications for organizations. And I'll just talk through some of those implications now. First of all, is the ability to move goods and services across borders. The type of trade deal the UK might secure in the wake of Brexit is still really to be agreed. At the moment, we have agreed the exit terms, which still need to be ratified, but the future trading terms are still to be determined. This could take many forms, ranging from some access to the single market, some structure of some form of customs union, which would continue tariff-free trade on goods and services, to the other end of the spectrum, where tariffs could be applied on all goods and services and traded between the UK and EU, and likely would be based on WTO rules. Any barriers, such as new physical custom borders, would undoubtedly have a significant bearing on a company's ability to move goods across borders, and there would also be costs involved in doing so. The reintroduction of any physical border between Ireland and Northern Ireland would not only disrupt trade, but as we've seen, would also cause divisions and tensions between communities. And this has been one of the major points of contention during the exit negotiations. Secondly, there'll be changes invariably changes to your cost base. Brexit will invariably have an impact on the cost base of businesses that have UK operations, regardless of the type of deal that is secured. whether this is in the form of new tariffs, which may be passed on directly onto customers or even absorbed by organisations, or other costly measures such as the expense associated with complying with the EU rules of origin regulations in the event of a customs union exit. Brexit has had well-documented and significant impact on costs for UK organisations through the changes in exchange rate, through the changes in exchange rates. Thirdly, the potential new routes to market and new supply chain operating models. Businesses need to consider the who and where they're going to sell from and to in the UK and EU. They also need to think about the what and the where we buy, produce, store, distribute and service from. And all these points will need to be considered prior to exiting the EU. There'll be changes to the regulatory environment. The regulatory environment for both the UK and European countries has the potential to significantly change. Whether the end result is a Chequers deal or a WTO terms will largely determine whether regulation underpinning each industry is set to remain closely aligned with the EU or whether it will shift away from the status quo. The most likely consequences an increasingly high regulation burden for businesses ranging from complying with multiple regulatory systems. For example, UK companies who want to operate in Europe are likely to be obliged to comply to GDPR or other similar regulations in future. And European companies having to comply with potential new UK regulations as legal frameworks potentially diverge. And as well as day-to-day obstacles to businesses, e.g. the administrative burden of recruitment of EU nationals into the UK. Which brings us on to the final implication and the impacts on our workforce. There is a significant threat to the British economy. There is a significant threat that the British economy could face a labour supply shortage due to Brexit. In recent years, foreign and particularly EU workers have made up a substantial amount of the total workforce within the UK and have invigorated the economy and helped companies grow as they fill roles that have been unable to be filled by UK nationals. However, this access to labour may change in future. Indeed, this particular area may impact some industries more than others, with some UK industries or regions much more heavily impacted by potential restrictions on immigration than others. For instance, in London, 38% of the construction workforce is of an EU origin. So how are organisations preparing for Brexit? Well, it's fair to say that the status of preparations by organisations is very mixed. Some organisations have advanced plans, and a recent CBI survey indicated about 58% of businesses have formulated some form of contingency plan, and 41% of businesses surveyed have already carried out some of those contingency plans. However, at the other end of the spectrum, a number of organisations are still waiting to see what happens. A recent Grant Thornton International Business Report indicated that 22% of businesses have done no planning whatsoever for Brexit, and 28%, whilst they might have started planning, still remain at the early stages of the development of those plans. And where those plans are in place, GEP's experience is that these plans are focused on core operations of the business, or the direct procurement side of supplier spend. So operations such as manufacturing and distribution, and direct procurement categories such as raw materials and packaging. But what about the rest of the goods and services? This still leaves a proportion of activity and spend for which the risk has not been assessed for a lot of organisations. And these goods and services may still have a significant impact on your business's ability to operate effectively. So I just wanted to undertake a quick poll of the attendees, just really to understand the state of the nation of the preparations of the audience on the webinar today. So I have a really simple question. Does your organisation have a Brexit plan? And there's there's a multiple choice, and there's four possible answers to the question. So first answer is yes, we do have a plan, but it's for direct goods and services only. The direct raw materials and packaging services only. Secondly, yes, we do have a plan, but it's for indirect goods and services only. The third is yes, we have a plan for both direct and indirect goods and services. And finally, no, we have no plan for either direct or indirect goods and services. So I'll just let the survey run. It should take a minute or so for you to provide your answers and for those answers to come through. So we just leave that for a moment or two. I suppose I could put the answer in for GEP, but I guess you could probably all see where we would be. But I'm pleased to say that we do have a plan in place. Do we know whether the survey results are ready? Can we just check? Okay, so that's really interesting in terms of the results. I think that's pretty much in line with our expectations. You know, we do see a high proportion of organisations that have a plan in place for direct goods. As I said earlier, we are seeing a lot of organisations, you know, it's core to their businesses, and therefore you know, they're very much focusing on the risk in that space. Expectation is that yes, you know, there will be fewer, lower proportion that have only got plans in place for indirect goods and services only. I suspect those are organisations that don't have a huge amount of direct goods and services actually. I would be interested to find a bit more about those. Pleasing to see a slightly higher proportion for those that have plans in place for both direct and indirect goods and services. I guess the last one actually, I'm quite surprised actually, but no, the last one is no plan for either direct or indirect goods and services. So I guess that's in line with the Thornton survey, slightly higher than that actually. I mean, I guess you know my comments on this, you know, is that you know there is no time to lose actually in terms of pulling the plans together. So you know it's really about trying to pull together that risk assessment, and hopefully today's session will give you some insight and ideas as to how best to do that. Okay, thank you for submitting the responses. That's really interesting. Okay, so what role should procurement play in the planning for Brexit? The implications for European supply chains will be significant, so procurement does have a big role to play. Supply chain impacts will be some of the most significant to businesses from Brexit, so supply chain functions will need to play a key role in identifying and addressing those Brexit risks. As a widespread business impact, we need to think beyond just the manufacturing and logistics companies to other organisations in other sectors. There's a high proportion of large businesses still have a significant UK presence, e.g. operations and sales functions. This is not just a UK and EU problem. I'm not sure the demographic on the call today, whether or not we're primarily UK or EU organisations, but organisations from outside of the EU need to think about the impact of their businesses, as even large businesses with no significant UK presence can actually witness significant impact on their European supply chains. And finally, just to say, to follow on from the poll, you know, there is direct and indirect impact on supply chains. What we see is the indirect supply base is still significant and should not be overlooked. For example, a typical consumer goods organisation, their indirect spend can be in the region of around about 40% of their total external expenditure. So it is an opportunity to act now. Those people that haven't started their plans, we still have time to do that. And these are the recommended steps. These are the so what do we recommend are the steps that are taken by organisations to start their planning. First of all is to measure the exposure to Brexit risks. Procurement and supply chain teams have the perfect opportunity to facilitate a cross-functional initiative to identify business functions and supply categories that are going to be impacted by Brexit. They can ensure a joined-up approach when developing and implementing these contingency plans. Further focus can be given to supply chain and procurement areas to identify contracts and suppliers, pricing, and impacts to business continuity in any new UK-EU trading environment. Secondly, engage with suppliers and potentially identify alternative supply strategies. We recommend undertaking a comprehensive risk assessment with the supply base to understand any key risks that they have identified, as well as the status of their plans to mitigate any of these risks. We should establish target commodity groups by conducting a prioritisation based on goods and service criticality, availability of supply, and the time required to qualify new supply sources. Thirdly, be equipped to do the heavy lifting. Get the procurement function ready to ensure that there's sufficient capability and resource to undertake not just the risk assessment, but also all the potential follow-up activities, including vendor negotiations, contracting, and supplier relationship management. And this is going to be as well as on top of the day job. And finally, become an enabler for Brexit opportunities. As the EU and UK and EU trade negotiations become clearer, and the UK potentially starts to focus on trade deals with other non-EU countries, buyers will need to aim potentially to offset cost increases, but may gain access to different sources of supply that may offer lower costs. And buyers may even benefit from more innovation from their vendors. Whilst we talk a lot about risks related with Brexit, there will be opportunities as well, and we shouldn't lose sight of those. So how have GEP been supporting some of our clients? I wanted to talk you through a practical example. I wanted to talk you through a case study, which is a practical example to demonstrate some of the tools and techniques that you can use to measure the exposure and put in place plans to ensure that your business is prepared. Firstly, just a little bit about the client in this case study. They're a global consumer goods organization with about $13 billion US dollars revenue per annum. Their external spend is around about 8.5 billion, and they have a big presence in Europe with about spend of around about 1.5 billion in Europe specifically. The direct supply base is the biggest part of their spend, around about 65% of their spend, but the indirect supply base is still significant at around about 35% of their overall spend. So what was the approach that we took? Well, in relation to the direct supply base, to an extent, this was slightly more straightforward. This is a strategically managed category with a number of core strategic suppliers. And early on, the business put in place a risk plan to understand and manage any risks related to the supply of packaging and raw materials to and from their UK operations. In relation to the indirect supply base, working with the client, we realised that this was an area that needed to be evaluated as there was an unknown risk. Initially, no planning had been put in place for this spend area. We also recognised it was a very more complex area than the direct spend. The spend was fragmented across 6 different main category groups, and with over 3,000 suppliers involved in supplying indirect goods and services to the organisation. So what was the recommended approach that we took? So our recommendation was to take a two-stage approach. First of all, was to undertake a category level risk assessment. And for this, we engaged with key business stakeholders right across the organisation. We also considered all Brexit scenarios in our evaluation, including the EEA, bilateral, but really we focused on the FTA and the WTO scenarios as the most likely outcomes of any negotiations. For each category, we assessed key risk areas across supply chain, cross-border trade, regulations, labour and people, and procurement. And when I say procurement, I'm thinking we meant here things like contract, not just contracts in commercial terms with suppliers, but also the operational function of procurement, i.e. key performance indicators around savings pipeline, but also in terms of resourcing for the function itself. The impact of these risk areas, the impact and relevance of these risk areas did depend upon the category itself. So, for example, temporary labour, people and regulations had a significant impact, but less so in terms of trade. But when we looked at things like MRO or spares, engineering spares, the supply chain was absolutely critical, but less so in terms of regulations. Following this evaluation, we created a comprehensive risk assessment, and this identified and allocated a risk level and description against each individual risk, along with a plan to address. Each risk was rated either high, medium, and low. As I say, a plan was associated with each high or medium risk level. Second stage of this was a supplier risk assessment. And we took a tiered approach to the risk assessment by looking at our suppliers and trying to prioritise which suppliers were going to be the most impacted. As I say, we had about 3,000 suppliers for this particular client, and that would have been too unwieldy, and indeed a number of those suppliers were small, potentially transactional suppliers. However, we didn't lose focus on, in terms of spend. We also wanted to understand those suppliers that we were particularly vulnerable to in relation to cross-border trade. So organisations that may be providing small spend, maybe small in terms of spend, but maybe providing a crucial service from the EU into the UK and vice versa. So we eventually took the approach of tiering our suppliers from strategic, high importance, and medium importance, and that enabled us to focus our time and energies on a smaller number of suppliers across the supply base. So what were the results from the exercise itself? I will show you examples of the output, but just to sort of summarise the key outputs, just to summarise the key results from the exercise itself. First and foremost, we created a comprehensive risk assessment across all external spend, from direct and including indirect, at a category and supplier level. A heat map approach overview that allowed the organisation to easily pinpoint any high-risk categories or suppliers. Risk mitigation plans were developed, again, at both a category and a supplier level. And the client is now prepared for the most likely Brexit scenarios, from WTO to FTA. So, just to share some of the practical output from the exercise itself. The first stage of the category risk assessment was undertaken alongside the key stakeholders. And in our advice, it's really important to bring their insight and expertise into the assessment at the early stage in order to get that comprehensive overview and that comprehensive assessment. We did create detailed category level plans that were created for each of the category areas that considered and identified all the risks, and then we rated them in terms of the impact to the business. I'm not going to show you how now the summary pages from each of the risk areas, but as I say, there was a detailed assessment for each of the categories. The summaries provided a clear visual overview of the potential risk areas that we needed to focus on as a business. The first area was supply chain. And as you can see here, for categories such as capital and MRO, we identified high risk in terms of goods that were going to be supplied in that particular category area, and therefore we needed plans were required to mitigate in that space. We also identified medium level risks in terms of delivery of goods and services across the supply chain, general professional services and IT. The next area we looked at was trade risk. And generally, this was overall was a fairly low risk area for this organisation. But what we did identify is that in logistics, there was a significant risk that needs to be addressed in terms of moving goods and services across different borders. From a regulatory perspective, again, looking at goods across each of the categories, very low risk. But actually, when we looked at the services, there was a number of medium to high risks, and actually in some of the category areas that we didn't expect to see it. So general professional services, and particularly in IT. And then finally, in terms of labour and people. So again, in terms of goods, very low risk. But in terms of the provision of services, we identified a number of high risk areas in our MRO category and general professional services category. So the main risks that we identified for the organisation, some of them were very consistent and common with the direct risk assessment that had been undertaken. So impacts in terms of lead times and stock shortages, increases in terms of tariffs and administration costs. But some risks that perhaps hadn't been identified before, impacts in terms of data protection regulations and how the business was going to operate from that perspective. Impacts in terms of freedom of movement of people and the impact on not just their temporary labour workforce, but also their own workforce. And also in terms of impacts around kind of territory-based contracts and the impact on the right to use in relation to software contracts and potentially intellectual property. And so the second stage of the exercise was the supplier risk assessment. I'll just share with you now some of the high-level output from the supplier risk assessment. So this assessment was based on a questionnaire that was structured around the category key risk areas, so supply chain, trade, etc., to ensure that we had continuity and consistency with the category level assessment. This was issued out to around about 300 plus suppliers based on our critical, high risk and medium risk supply base. And what this allowed us to do was to look at each of the suppliers in each of the categories and measure the risks and measure them against their risks that they had identified to their business that may impact us as the organisation, and also their mitigation plans. So how prepared were they to manage those risks on behalf of their own business and on behalf of their customers? We then detailed those identified risks that allowed us to quickly identify which areas that would need to be addressed. That was undertaken at a category level review. So the example previously was looking at MRO and capital, but we also rolled this up on an organisational level. And the heat map approach provided at the organisational level, provided an organisational level view of the key risk suppliers by category and by the sites that were likely to be impacted, bearing in mind that this particular client is a pan-European organisation with sites in the UK and in various European sites also. So this analysis allowed us to focus in on those suppliers and on those categories that really were at risk and understand the impact on the individual sites within the organisation. And so what did we learn from the approach to this exercise? So the first thing for me was around engaging stakeholders and suppliers at the earliest opportunity. And this really and truly enabled a comprehensive assessment with shared ownership and accountability in delivering any mitigation plans. The other learning is about applying rigour in prioritising your supplier, in terms of prioritising your supply base, both there is a balance to be taken here in terms of breadth and covering all suppliers and all risks versus depth, and understanding the real risk areas and the key suppliers that you need to focus in on. As I said earlier, this isn't all about the big spending suppliers. This is about identifying suppliers that there is really a risk in relation to the services they provide. So don't lose sight of those smaller suppliers that may just be a few £1,000s or a few tens of £1,000s per annum. And finally, be structured in your analysis. You need to understand the detail, and the category managers need to understand the detail. But you really need to focus effort on the significant risks and indeed the opportunities. So just a quick discussion around how procurement technology can support the Brexit risk assessment. I say this is a significant exercise to undertake, and so I would advise you to use best use of any technology solutions that you have. In GEP, we have our product Smart by GEP, but our experience is that you can use other existing, you can use your existing purchase to pay or source to contract or contract management solutions. So where are the two areas that we found technology to be the most helpful for us? So first was around data analytics, and that was around spend management, understanding using the spend management tools and our contract database. This really helped us understand the key risk suppliers by understanding the country of origin, whether they were EU to UK. So drawing out not just the large suppliers, but also those smaller suppliers that are supplying cross-border, and also identifying those multi-territory based contracts as well, using the contracts database. The other area that we found technology really useful to use is in the supplier outreach. So undertaking the supplier exercise was a large undertaking. Whilst we reduced the number of suppliers for this particular client from 3,000 to around about 300, it's still a large undertaking. We viewed this as almost an RFI type exercise. So we were asking a number of suppliers and asking for responses from those suppliers. So we found using our source to contract technology extremely helpful in reaching out to a high number of suppliers. But also the sourcing technology can be used to create that risk questionnaire, to contact the suppliers in bulk, and actually to collate and then analyse the responses once they've been received. So what's next? How do we take this forward? How do you guys take this forward for your organisations? Well, the first thing I'd say is there is still time to plan, but now is the time to start. The clock is ticking, but as the case study that I've just talked through, this was a 3-month exercise, so it can be done. I would suggest that you only bite off. One word of advice is only to bite off what you can chew on. Try look at depth rather than breadth. Procurement have a great opportunity to take the lead at the moment. We can be at the forefront of providing valued insight and planning for the impact of Brexit for our organisations. It's a great opportunity for us to raise our profile, and we should be at the front and centre of this activity. The risk is if procurement don't do it, who will? And actually, it's a great opportunity for us to demonstrate that we are truly a valued partner to the organisations. I've mentioned a couple of times, a lot of focus is on managing the risks. When people talk about Brexit in the media, it's often very negative, but there will be opportunities, new suppliers, innovations, and often from adversity, great ideas can emerge. So don't lose sight of the opportunities when undertaking your assessment at a category and the supplier level. And be agile and adapt to the changing political situation. Yes, we should be planning for the different scenarios, and indeed you may want to plan for the worst, but that scenario may change soon. But you'll need to continue to focus on whatever the outcome might be. Hopefully things will become clearer over the coming weeks, but who knows? So that concludes the presentation, the webinar, in terms of the content. I hope that's provided you with insight and some practical tools and techniques for preparing your organisation for Brexit. I think we now have some opportunity for questions and answers, which will hopefully be able to answer.
Thank you, Rob.
Thank you, Daniel.
Thank you, Rob. I hope everyone found that really valuable. There's obviously uncertain times ahead for business, but there's real opportunities for procurement to elevate your position, be more strategic, add value, all the things that we want to do. And this sounds like a great opportunity. And we are the profession that is well placed to support the what, where, how organisations sell to, buy from, manage the risk, and also be the key enabler for the opportunities. So it's not all doom and gloom, there will be opportunities. And I think it's key that procurement are at the centre of those opportunities. And ensuring we've got the capability within our teams to support and understand the detail and really run with those innovations and things that come up. It's not going to be without challenge, we all know that. It's very uncertain and change is quite unsettling sometimes, but with what Rob and I have mentioned today, it's quite clear that time is of the essence now. So at least the webinar today is quite timely, and to cover depth rather than breadth. Be agile as possible and have robust plans in place. So hopefully all of today has helped you with that. We've got quite a few questions that have come in already. So if we start with the first one, Rob, are you ready? What are the main indirect categories likely to be impacted by Brexit, and what are the main risks?
I think our evidence is that I think most of the indirect categories will be impacted in some way. So when we undertook the assessment for this particular client, our view probably at the start was that IT and professional services would probably be less impacted, but the capital and MRO and some of the indirect categories involved in moving goods and services would be heavily impacted. Actually, when we undertook the activity itself and the assessment, what we found is that the different categories were very much impacted in different ways. So I gave a few examples as we went through. Professional services very much impacted from the freedom of movement or movement of or availability of labour. The interesting one came from IT and technology in terms of GDPR and the impact of GDPR and how organisations are going to treat, certainly in a WTO scenario. And then around some of the license terms as well, particularly around kind of territory-based contracts and the right to use, where we have EU, so EULA agreements, how those are going to be treated if the UK becomes a third country. So I would say that there isn't one that stood out in particular. I think when you're undertaking your assessments, I would do it across all of them, because you may find there's a few surprises in there that you weren't quite expecting.
Great, thank you, Rob. So we've obviously talked today quite a lot about the risks around Brexit and how to manage those, but you also mentioned that there will be quite a lot of opportunities, and procurement can be an enabler with some of those opportunities. So can you give us any idea in terms of what opportunities procurement might have as a result of Brexit, or any specific categories?
Yeah, I mean, I guess that the main one is around kind of that greater of it. I think from a professional services perspective, it's the opportunity to provide a level playing field for skilled resources, or required resources actually, not just skilled resources, to come into the organisation. So you can start to look further afield at other organisations and get greater access to potentially to resources from those countries. In terms of supplying goods and services, again, it's looking at countries outside of the EU. and and potential new sources of supply, and opening up your supply chains to those new markets. Are the key ones. Look, I think everybody at the moment is focused on the risks, and that's the right thing. That's the right thing to do. So I wouldn't say there is a lot of opportunities that are apparent right at this point in time. But as we move through, hopefully a deal will be agreed. We won't end up in WTO situation come March next year, and then we've got 2 years to really understand what those opportunities are. And procurement needs to be at the forefront within their organisation, identifying what those opportunities are and bringing them to their business.
Thank you, Rob. We've got quite a lot of questions coming in about kind of risk assessing the supply chain and the factors to consider to be most important. And I know you mentioned the supplier risk assessment outreach. What are the most important factors to consider? And in terms of the attitude of suppliers in terms of providing responses through the risk assessment outreach, what's been the reaction?
I guess it's sort of two questions there. The reaction from the suppliers actually was fairly positive. It has been positive, in our experience. Again, I think if you engage them early and you are clear in terms of what the reason for reaching out to them is, what is the purpose of the risk assessment, is to I suppose act in a collaborative way and act in conjunction with them, rather than using it as you're not prepared for Brexit, what are you going to do about it? It should be a joint effort. So with this particular client, that's the approach we took. We were open and honest with the suppliers to say, we want to understand, so collectively we can pull together a plan to address any risks. So don't hide those risks from us. We won't hide any implications from us. And equally, we won't use it as a stick to beat you with later on down the line. If we know the risks, we can address them. In terms of the key risk areas to consider, again, it does depend on the category areas. We structured it across the 5 main areas. So we looked at supply chain risk, trade risk, regulatory risk, and what was the first? Labour and people risk. So they were the 4 externally focused, so the externally facing risks that we assessed against. We then had one largely internal focus risk assessment, which is around the impact to procurement in inverted commas. So what's the impact on our contracts? Do we need to look at our purchase order terms? Do we need to change those? Do we need to change our systems around goods receipting and different tax regimes? There was a whole load of things that we needed to consider in that space as well. So they were the main kind of externally facing considerations. Does that answer the questions that are coming in? I can't see all the content here, but yeah, okay.
Yes, yeah, I think so. And where some suppliers have confirmed that they have plans in place, for example, given the level of uncertainty, we've got a question on how much trust can you actually place on their planning, and what should you be asking for?
So a really great question, actually. So again, I think this is where you look to prioritise your suppliers. So one is about the messaging first and foremost. So being open and honest about it and trying to understand whether they see risks. But I think this is where it comes into prioritising your suppliers. And we didn't necessarily take on face value their answers. We then went through a process of testing that with them, not in in an aggressive way. It was look, you've said that there is no risk around we talk about temporary labour, contingent labour. Talking to some of those suppliers, they were saying we see no risk. We have a plan in place, and there's no risk for us as a business. Our view though is that actually we think there probably is, and we just want to explore that a little bit further. So we did some face-to-face sessions with those suppliers just to walk through the questions that we asked them and the answers that they provided, and just to make sure that we were all comfortable with the answers that had been provided. So therefore, that helped us build the trust in, so when they said, yes, we have a plan, or, no, there is no risk to us as a business, we were then confident that that was the case. I think there is an element of trust still with some of the suppliers. That's always going to be the case, but that was the approach that we took. We really prioritised some of those suppliers across the organisation. And again, it was looking at some of those suppliers that there might have been some of the smaller suppliers, but where they were providing perhaps from a European base into a UK plant, for example, and it had the risk of interrupting production. Then we would focus in on them as a supplier and test their answers and test their things to make sure that we were comfortable.
Yes, the key thing there is to prioritise, validate and test, really, to ensure that you fully kind of trust what they're saying is in place.
Yeah, correct.
Yeah, okay. The tips. Do you expect UK suppliers to move to Europe? Quite general.
It's a good question. We didn't see any. There was evidence of suppliers putting in plans in place. What we didn't see was an evidence of somebody saying we are no longer going to supply out the UK. We are going to relocate our businesses wholly to Europe as a result of Brexit. Certainly not with the case study that I've just talked through. What we did see is some evidence of organisations saying that they would establish satellite offices and distribution centres or facilities in European organisations, and in fact vice versa. So whether a European organisation, they're saying that they would look to have some sort of operation in the UK, even if that was just a short term to manage any transition from and once kind of the transition processes are completed, and business as usual had returned, however many years that's going to take. That was the evidence that we saw, but we didn't see wholesale we're going to be moving out of the UK, therefore we can't supply you anymore. We didn't find any of those risks, either in the indirect or the direct, actually.
Okay. This is a category-specific question. You may or may not be able to answer it. We've only got a couple of minutes left. So what were the major Brexit impacts you identified on IT categories? I think everyone's obviously looking at their IT at the moment in terms of digitalisation, so it's of great importance in this area.
Yeah, I mean, there's some of I suppose the obvious ones, but we didn't see a huge amount of risk in terms of kind of hardware. So I think that was one area that we wanted to that we needed to explore. But I think most of the suppliers had contingency plans in place or pre-existing supply chains in place that weren't going to be impacted. So some of the key areas that we found risks were when we think about telecoms and mobile services. That is one of the areas that the data roaming EU regulations, or the roaming regulations that are in place with the EU. What is going to happen post Brexit? I think the UK government and actually the carriers themselves are trying to provide assurances, but they're not absolutely committing to we're going to continue those services. The other areas were some of the practical, but some of the kind of commercial terms related to software and the license terms for using those, and the impact on those territory-based contracts. So where we have a EULA, will the UK still will UK organisations and businesses operating in the UK under a EULA agreement, will those still be valid? So that was one of the risks that we identified. Now most organisations are saying we will continue to honour those agreements. You won't need to go out and buy a new license, but it was one of those areas that is a risk that we will continue to stress test with some of the organisations.
Great, thank you, Rob. And I'm sorry to everyone, we've slightly run over. We've got so many questions that we've not yet answered. So GEP will endeavour to get in contact with you to answer those directly. Thank you so much for the overwhelming response with questions. That's amazing. And thank you for so many of you for being on the webinar with us today. I think it's at the forefront of mind. Everyone knows what they want to knows that we need to do some things. So any more questions, you feel free to go back to GEP or come through to CIPS directly, and we'll be able to guide you in a bit more detail. So the webinar from today will be sent out to you following attending today. It will also be available on the Knowledge Partnership page on the CIPS website, along with the Brexit report I mentioned at the beginning as well. So I'd just like to end by saying thank you so much to Rob for your time today and such an insightful webinar, and answering as many questions as we could. And I'd just like to say thank you and enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Goodbye.
Thank you, everybody.